This is Commissioner Frank Avila speak, and the name of our show is Genetically Engineer Food, What You Need to Know. And I have as my guest, I have Joan Levin. She's the Legislative Director of Illinois Right to Know GMO. And she's an expert on your right to know GMO. Thanks for being on our show, Joan.
Thank you for having me, Frank. It's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon.
Okay, you know what? Everyone reads the paper. They call it GMO, genetic engineering food. Can you explain to the audience what are we talking about when we say genetically engineered food or GMO?
Okay, GMO are initials that stand for genetically modified organisms. It's a term that's gone out of fashion a little bit, so it really isn't quite as accurate, but people are used to saying GMOs, and it's used fairly synonymously, meaning the same as genetically engineered food. But really, we should be saying genetically engineered food. That's a little more of a mouthful. And basically, it means foods that are produced from plants that are produced in the following ways, which have nothing to do with traditional agricultural breeding practices. They will take the genetic material, the genes, the DNA from one plant or from one species. It might be a bacteria, it could be an animal, something completely unrelated to the target plant, and put that genetic material forcibly into the genetic strand of the receiving plant in order to create a certain trait, a certain ability in the new plant. This has a lot of problems. We still don't know what exactly happens to the receiving plant during this process. We need to do more studies that are called genetic sequencing studies. We really don't have them, and there are some reasons why we don't, which I hope to get into later. Also, the reasons that we do this to plants are basically for two reasons. The first is to allow plants to withstand the application of a weed killer. Now, why would we want plants to be able to withstand a weed killer? So that when we're trying to eradicate the weeds near the plants, we can simply spread the weed killer everywhere and it won't kill the plants that we want. Well, the weed killer that we use most today is called glyphosate. It's popularly known as Roundup. If you've ever used Roundup in your garden, you know there are all sorts of instructions on it about how to use it safely, about how to keep it away from little children, about all sorts of rules about covering your body and so forth when you're using it. This is a toxin. And so now this can be applied to foods that we eat.
Oh, they're using Roundup now also? Now, do you know much about atrazine?
That's the next step. I'm going to come to that in a second, atrazine, because the problem is that now we have weeds that are becoming Roundup resistant. We call them super weeds. So we have to go to something stronger. So now there is coming up next on the market a weed killer called 2,4-D, which you've probably heard of. It was one of the components in Agent Orange used in Vietnam. And that's going to be the next step to be putting into plants to make them resistant so we can put 2,4-D all over the food crops. Other weed killers might be atrazine, might be some other chemicals that are highly toxic. So we're very concerned about that because as each one gets into general use, these weeds start to grow that are super weeds that can resist them. So that's one of the things that we do this for. The other major reason why we do this process to plants is to make them produce inside their cells an insecticide called Bt. Now, how do they do this? There's a bacteria. You don't have to remember the bacteria's name. It's called Bacillus thuringiensis. You don't have to remember that, but you need to remember its initials, and its initials are Bt. And this bacteria produces a toxin. So they take, which is an insecticide. So they take the genes from this bacteria and they insert it into the target plant, the corn, the soybeans, whatever. Now, Bt toxin is fairly benign. It biodegrades quickly. it's even used by organic gardeners. So it really isn't a terrible thing, except that that's when it's sprayed on the outside of a plant. When it's being produced inside the plant cells itself, it becomes much more potent, much more concentrated, and you can't wash it off. It doesn't biodegrade. It's in there permanently. And now they're finding metabolites of Bt toxin and metabolites of glyphosate. These are some of the chemical components in the blood of newborn infants whose mothers ate these foods. And so this is something to be concerned about.
So you're saying that when they apply it outside the plant, it washes off.
It washes off. It biodegrades. It's not as big a deal.
Not a big a deal because it's not what you're eating. It's not there.
Right.
But the difference is that when they inject it in,
it grows inside the cells of the plant. You cannot get to it that way. It's in the cells of the plant.
And the cells. So are they putting it in the seeds of
This is
crops?
how the seeds are made. The seeds are made with the seeds are imbued with the trait of being able that the plant will grow from the seed able to produce this toxin, or in the case of glyphosate resistant Roundup Ready crops, they're called, able to resist applications of this toxic weed killer.
So now the food that we are eating now, there's no research being done, or is there, on the health of people when they're eating these plants, except now the research is being done when they're born, and it's too late then. Is that what you're saying?
Well, there was this one study that some doctors in Canada did where they looked at the blood of mothers who had eaten these foods, and then when their infants were born, right away when they were born, before they had anything to eat, they took some blood from the umbilical cord so that it wasn't invasive to the infants to see what was in there. But this was just one study. What we do have is animal studies. It would be, first of all, impossible and actually unethical to do these studies on human populations. We do them on the same animals that we use to test the drugs, the pharmaceuticals that we take. These have all been tested with animals to see if they're toxic. They don't go to human testing until we've cleared them with animal testing. There are some animal studies. There are some animal studies done by industry that apparently show some safety, but they haven't been carried out over a long term. And some scientists have complained that industry doesn't release the raw data so that you really can't tell what's going on. And you also don't know if industry has done studies that came out showing problems that they've withheld. We do have some independent studies, and there have been some independent studies that show some problems. And normally in the course of science, what you do when a study shows problems of this sort, other scientists do what's called replication. They do the same thing exactly. It's like if your neighbor gave you a recipe for her cookies and you wanted to see if you could make the same cookies, so you use her recipes and you make the same cookies, and if they come out the same and a few other people try the recipe, then you know you've got a good recipe. Well, these replication studies are routinely done in science, except instead of doing, in the case of these studies that show danger in the animal studies resulting, alleged to result from GMOs, from genetically modified foods, instead of doing these replication studies, instead in many cases the scientists doing the studies were attacked. Their reputations were attacked. And these are some very eminent scientists.
Yes, I was reading an article, where was I, on this one scientist, Tyrone, he was doing a study on anthracene.
Which is another chemical which hasn't been approved for GM use
yet. And he went into his study, he saw that his research showed that should not use anthracene.
Well, that's right.
And so they didn't want him to publish it, and I forgot what article I was reading. It was in the article, and they tried to ruin his reputation.
Well, this happened recently to a scientist with glyphosate.
Okay, and so this is why you here and you want to speak about genetic engineered food and why more research should be done on the health side.
And it's not only that I think it should be done. I want to get to the legal aspects of this because this is really important. But I want to say, if people are wondering what are some of the kinds of things that we are seeing, the document I have here is it's a position paper produced by the American Academy of Environmental Medicine. You can get it online at their website.
What's that again called?
The American Academy for Environmental Medicine.
For environmental medicine.
Yeah, these are doctors who specifically are interested. It's a small group, but it's specifically pointed at hazards to health from the environment. And they did a study of this, and they reviewed the literature of what had been done. And they found in some of these animal studies, they found some things including infertility, immune dysregulation, accelerated aging, dysregulation of genes associated with cholesterol synthesis. Well, that could affect heart attack and stroke. Insulin regulation problems, that could affect diabetes. Cell signaling, the way the cells signal to each other in the body to do so many different processes. Protein formation, and changes in the liver, kidney, spleen, and gastrointestinal system.
Oh my God.
Virtually every system of the body affected in these animal studies. These are just a few studies, and they present them in their research. So
and they have no interest either way.
No,
they just want to do the study, and the way it comes out, it just comes out.
That's how it comes out. Now,
and that's why, is that why now we have problems now with our babies, and they get the first grade, second grade learning?
I'm not prepared to say that because we have so many exposures in our environment. We have so many toxic exposures to single out one and say, well, this is the cause of this and this is the cause of that. I'm not prepared to go there. Sure. But here's what I am prepared to say. In 1938, and please forgive me if I get a little bit wonkish, there was perceived to be some serious difficulties involving pharmaceutical drugs. And as a result, our Congress passed the Food and Drug Act the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. And at that time, it required new drugs on the market to go through specific kinds of testing and to be able to show what good and what harm they did before they were put on the market. But by 1958, it had become clear that there were things being added to food, that there were changes being made in food that were also of concern. There were many new chemicals being added to food and many new processes being done to food. And there was a lot of concern about that. And so in 1958, we amended the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to provide that when new food substances came up for consideration, if they hadn't been considered before 1958, they could be, well, if new food substances came up for consideration, they had to go through a certain process of giving notice to the public and a federal petition, and they had to show the science. But there was one category that was set aside, and it was called generally recognized as safe. Now, there are things we use in food that we've used forever. Your grandma made cookies. She used spices and sugar, and maybe she added salt to some of her dishes. Things that have been used just since forever. So they said, well, things that have been in safe use up to 1958, and they can show they've been safely used. They don't have to go through this process particularly to be shown as generally recognized as safe. But in order to be shown as generally recognized as safe, which is GRAS, and it's pronounced GRAS. GRAS is like the acronym for generally recognized as safe. They have to show, if it's since 1958, they have to show that there's really scientific consensus that these foods really are the foods produced by these processes really were safe, that this insertion of the new genes really resulted in food that was safe to eat. And they have to show by consensus of scientific opinion, they have to show published scientific papers, they have to show even non-published work if it came from reliable scientific sources. This was about science.
Yeah.
And so when the Food and Drug Administration scientists, the senior scientists, the men and women who have the PhDs and the MDs and the DVMs and the people who have the background and have been working with this kind of thing for years, They looked at this and they said, wait a minute, there are some problems here. We cannot put these foods right out on the market to millions of people. We have questions, we have concerns. They named their specific concerns. They even wrote memoranda addressing these concerns, and you can look at these memoranda on the internet.
Sure.
These are all available for public view. They came out in a lawsuit years ago. But they were overridden. And who were they overridden by? They were overridden by the political appointees, their seniors at the Food and Drug Administration.
And this is why you're so concerned about here in the state of Illinois.
Mm-hmm.
What-
This is why I'm concerned everywhere, but I want to read you one
Sure.
little passage then. In 1992, after these scientists had expressed their deep concern and expressed them to their bosses, expressed them to their agencies, I mean, these were out there, there was a document printed which was a guidance to industry. It was not a law. It wasn't even a regulation that had been properly put forward according to our Administrative Procedures Act. It was just a guidance. And I want to quote it exactly. I don't want to miss a word of it. So listen to some of these words. The agency, that is the Food and Drug Administration, is not aware of any information showing that foods derived by these new methods differ from other foods in any meaningful or uniform way, or that they present any greater safety concern than foods developed by traditional plant breeding. They were not aware. Their own senior scientists, the people, the men and women who we pay with our tax money,
Yes.
the MDs, the PhD, the experts, were telling them something. And these senior politicians at the top of the Food and Drug Administration said they weren't aware. Well, this was really of concern because they went on to say they did not believe that this would be required to be disclosed in labeling for the food.
Oh,
So that's where
and that was back when 1990.
that was in 1992. That was published
and their
in May
top
1990.
scientists were
Yeah.
telling them that it's
Yeah.
not safe with all
Right.
this new
Right.
additives in the food in 1990.
Yeah.
Now we're in 2014,
and we still have that. That issue.
yeah,
in
we still
front
have
of us.
that issue,
Yeah.
and so it appears that the Food and Drug Administration is not keeping the public safe on.
That's right. I think they
on
broke.
what's
I
on the
do
market.
believe they broke faith with the public there, and this was the agency that was formed to protect us
And
from.
they're not. As
and
it
they,
appears-
and they, I believe,
And now, and this memorandum that they wrote.
this is published in the Federal
Okay,
Register.
and the other report that the scientists gave them is that on
Yeah, they're online.
they're
You
online.
can go to a website called it's a website called Biointegrity.
yeah.
I'll be glad if anybody wants to write to me. My email address is legislabel, LEGISLABEL, all one word, at gmail.com. That goes right to me. I'll be glad to send you the link to all of these memoranda written by the scientists saying, wait a second, we have some problems, we're concerned, it's too soon, they might turn out to be safe, but we don't know that yet. And so my feeling is now this is just my opinion, is that every single genetically modified food that's come out since then should be tested according to
Yes.
this standard. What the government does test for is two things. They test it for environmental impact, and they test it for impact on other plant species. They do not consider comments on health or safety, however. And usually the environmental and the plant protection hurdles are very, very low hurdles. So this is of great concern. And now we have a bill introduced in the Congress of the United States, which, let me back up a little bit. It was clear to many of us working in this that the federal government was not going to do anything. They weren't going to test GMOs. They weren't even going to label them so that we could at least know what was in our food, so people could make their own decision. I want to eat this or I want to eat something else.
Well, if I personally myself,
Yeah.
if I were buying food, I would like to know how it was made. I would like to know if it was the original way that we grow
Sure.
crops versus
Yeah.
a genetic engineering type of crop.
Sure.
And I would, it would be up to me what I would choose. Now, I mean, I would choose the food that's a natural type of food. You know.
Well, you know, and we can all make our own choices.
And I want to
you
make
know.
my choice, and my kids.
You know,
my choice.
people come up to me and say, "Well, I want GMO foods." Well, fine. If they were labeled, you could select them. But now we have in about 26 states this past year introduced legislation in their state legislatures, including Illinois, to label GMOs, to require GMOs sold in that state to be labeled. Our bill in Illinois picked up a lot of support. However, right now it probably will not be coming up during the rest of this term, but it got a lot of publicity last summer with a lot of hearings. A lot of people are interested in it. A lot of our legislators have indicated willingness to support it. So I think in the next legislative session, it may really have a good chance. And this happened in many states. Bills passed actually in Maine and in Connecticut, although they are not going to be enacted until, according to the terms of those bills, until some other states also come in, because these small states don't want to be sued,
Sure.
which they probably would be.
Well,
and
yeah.
Vermont is in the process of coming very close to this. But the Grocery Manufacturers Association appeared at hearings for every one of these bills, and they are tired of going from place to place, spending a lot of money
Sure.
Testifying and preparing
And
for
time.
testimony against these bills. And the reason the Grocery Manufacturers Association is doing it is that the individual food companies are finding if they end up publicly coming out against labeling, that they tend to be boycotted.
Yeah.
So they're letting their association carry the water for them, which the Grocery Manufacturers Association is doing. And now we have a bill that apparently was the work of the Grocery Manufacturers Association, introduced in the Congress, at the national level in Congress. And it is called HR 4432, and it's been entitled the Safe and Accurate Food Labeling Act, which is a little bit, to call that bill the Safe and Accurate Food Labeling Act is a little bit like giving a serial killer a humanitarian award.
Sure. So the wording is read like it looks it's
like
going to protect the
yeah.
public.
So we're calling it the Denying Americans Right to Know, or DARK, D-A-R-K Act, because it's going to keep us in the dark. And what this bill is going to do, if it should pass, and I don't think it will, I certainly hope it doesn't, would be to actually forbid labeling at either the state or the federal level, to tell the Food and Drug Administration that it does not have the authority to require labeling, and to make that carry over to the states as well. And so that's something that if people feel like calling their congressman to say, please say no to HR 4432, that would be great. Or just to say, you know what, we don't need a bill to stop labeling.
Now, so the bill that is going to be presented here in the state of Illinois, if they pass that bill in Congress, that bill will override any state bills that any state will have on their books.
And we are also considering entering into a foreign trade agreement called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which, if it were to go through, could also stop GMO labeling as being somehow in restraint of trade.
So we're looking at two types of bills.
We're looking at attacks from all over.
Oh my God.
But you know what? That's the good news, because you know what? A year or two ago, nobody was even talking about this. In 1 year, this has gained so much momentum that right now we've really been noticed. And so hopefully the American public is wising up. And one of the things that every single person can do is to learn what foods on the market, there aren't that many of them, are GMO, and simply not buy them. Because when sales drop off by just 5%, 10%, 5%, you reach a tipping point where the companies say, you know what, let's produce something else. And as a matter of fact, in 2009, according to Supermarket News, no GMO-free labeling was the fastest growing store brand health-related label. So there has been an interest in this, and it's growing.
Well, all my friends want to buy all non-GMO food, and they look for that.
Yeah.
And that's why they go to the stores that do not have the GMO products. They want to go to those type of stores.
Right.
And it's growing. But they were saying that some of the people are saying, well, it will increase the cost of the food. A source would be impossible. And they got all type of excuses.
Okay, let's look at some
of
those. Let's look at some of those objections. First of all, bear in mind that GMOs are labeled in over 62 countries now. Most of the world labels GMOs.
Oh.
The entire Western industrial world labels GMOs. A few countries ban GMOs entirely, but in the countries where GMOs are labeled, the same food companies that produce one kind of food here are producing non-GMO foods. You know, the international companies they're producing non-GMO foods to ship abroad.
Yeah, but why are they having a hard? Why are they want to give the people here a hard time then?
Well, you know, every time we've had information, there has been objections to it. 50 years ago, I was working on this. I'm giving away my age now, but 50 years ago, I was working to get car safety information to people. And we were told very definitely by the car companies, we're not going to release this information. We're not going to tell you what our safety tests have shown. Now, car companies actually brag about it in their ads. I mean, you can look at car ads today and it brags about how well this car performed on safety tests.
Well, yeah. Well, so, it looks like it would be better for the manufacturers to give what the public wants.
It would be.
And at the end, everyone would be healthy maybe. They may be making a profit. So what type of companies will be suffering from this?
Well, probably most of all, it would be the companies that produce the seeds and that produce the chemical, and even more the chemicals that the seeds enable.
Okay, so that's where.
Yeah. I mean, to some extent, these seeds are a little bit like, remember when Gillette used to give away razor blades or sell them at a very low price, so people give away razors so that you'd buy the razor blades. So that's part of it. But the prices of food have not gone up in other countries. The relabeling, companies relabel their food every 6 months, more or less anyway. This is part of their cost of doing business.
Beautiful.